My name is Gertrude Brown Chitty Terry. The Gertrude came from my father's deceased sister. She died in childbirth, which always made me a little nervous that I was named after a dead sister. The Brown was my mother's maiden name. Chitty, of course, was the family name. And then when I married, it became Terry. When I was still living at home, and we had at 2953 Riverside, and we had all these built-in cupboards. And one day I was in the upstairs hallway, and there were seats that were built in so that you could sit there in front of the fire, because there was a fireplace in the hallway. And when you lifted up the top of these seats, there were things in the seat. Oftentimes there were just stacks and stacks and stacks of National Geographics. But one time when I was going through it, probably looking for a project, I came across a leather-bound book. And it was a baby book. And it was a baby book with the name Gertrude Kirk Chitty. And Kirk was not really a family name in that it was not an hereditary name, but there had been someone's, I think Captain George Harsh's third wife was named Kirk. It had my date of birth filled in. It did say I'd been born on a Monday. I do not remember that there was a time. And that was just about all there was in the book. Somebody thought I was going to be Gertrude Kirk Chitty, but that is not what is on my birth certificate. I did not ask anybody about the book because I don't believe there was anybody around at the time I found it that would have been able to answer the question. I believe Dolly remembers my saying something to her, but she would have had no idea, and I do not remember asking my father. If I did, I've forgotten what he said. According to my siblings, I was born in a doctor's hospital. It was called Rollins Hospital. It was on Riverside Avenue, and it was just a large house. And I believe I remember seeing that house years later and being told that is where I was born, but I don't believe it's there anymore. And I was born on April 15th, 1929, which was the year of the crash. Up until I was about 12, 13, 14 years old, April 15th was not tax day. March 15th was tax day. And I can remember when they changed the date from March 15th to April 15th, there was this great sigh of relief. Everybody had one more month before they had to pay their income taxes. So I may have been older than I think now, because I do remember that. I have no memories at all of my mother, who died when I was 15 months old. No memories of my first nurse. I do have memories of Mrs. Clements, who looked after me until I think I went to kindergarten or school or something. I don't remember that it was a hard time. I was very young. I do recall that there would be men that would come to the back door and ask for food. And our cook at the time was named Ruby, and Ruby would fix them food, and I frequently would sit with them because it was exciting for me to have somebody, and chances are maybe Dolly was home, but I don't remember anybody else especially being around, but I would go and sit with them while they ate, and then she would almost always give them something to take, a sandwich or something to take with them. They would talk to me, and they would tell me, maybe how old are you? And I would tell them, and they'd say, well, I have a daughter that age or a son that age or something. And I really was not aware that the times were hard. I remember my father saying, anybody that comes to the house and they're hungry, you give them food, but we don't have any money to give them. I do remember that. I never felt that we were deprived in any way, and maybe it was just because of my age. This is from what my older siblings have told me, that after Mama died And it was the Depression, and Daddy was not only facing his grief from losing someone he apparently loved very much, but there was a financial doom looming. John Martin took a paper sack into Daddy and put it on his desk in his office, and it was full of money, paper money. And he said, this is, because Daddy had just, was just about to lose everything. And John Martin was a wheeler and dealer. By that time, I think he'd already been governor then. And he just put a sack of money on Daddy's desk. Leon Cheek did the same thing. Leon Cheek said, I will back you in anything you let me know. And Helen Lane's father-in-law was president of the Atlantic Bank. I think he had started the Atlantic Bank. And he called Daddy on the phone and gave him, I think it was something like a $50,000 line of credit. Well, this was just manna from heaven. But I do remember that that was the depth of the relationship between my father and those two men. My recollection is that the siblings told me that when all this was happening, the Martins, who were childless, told Daddy that they would love to adopt Betty and me. And Auntie Cheek and Mr. Cheek, I don't think I ever called him Uncle Leon. Some of the other children may have, but I don't think I ever did. Wanted Billy. They loved Billy. They absolutely adored Billy and loved Dolly. And Dolly was named for Auntie Cheek because Auntie Cheek was Margaret. And then that left the two older children, Artie and Marion, who were sort of, I think Arthur Jr., he went to college earlier than you ordinarily would, graduated in 3 years, Phi Beta Kappa. He was just so smart. But that is my recollection of that story, as opposed to, and I guess maybe Dolly kept it in her mind that if anything did happen to Daddy, we had a place to go. I don't think I knew any of that at that time, so I just thought I was going to be an orphan. But I don't know. Daddy always prayed. Before he went to bed at night, he would get on his knees and pray by his bed, and also in the morning. And as a small child, I don't think I must have slept very much. I was a bad sleeper, I believe. And so I was always the first one up, frequently the first one up in the morning. And Daddy would be in his room on his knees, and I'd go and get on my knees beside him, and we would pray, not aloud. And I don't know what I was praying, but he was definitely into his prayers. Often at night, I would have been put to bed, but I would hear Daddy come up, and I would go and I'd say, Daddy, can I sleep with you tonight? And he slept in not a twin bed, what we used to call a 3/4 bed, but it's not very big. And I'd say, Daddy, can I sleep with you tonight? And bless his heart, he was this exhausted man who had been working all day, and he'd say, okay. And so I would get in bed with him, and I never woke up in bed with him, so obviously he would get up at some point and put me in my bed. But I do remember that on Sunday mornings, Dolly and I would get the Sunday paper, and we would go upstairs and get in bed, one of us on each side of Daddy, and he would read the comics to us. And I remember that quite well. And so that was fun. And this just astonished, I think, the older siblings, because their recollection was always of Daddy as the provider. He would come home, they would have dinner, but Mama was the one that would have done something like that. So this was quite startling, I think, for them. But, there just was no mother then, so he, in his own way, did what he could. We had an uncle, a bachelor uncle, who was my mother's brother. He'd sort of lost his home because he had been living with his brother and sister-in-law, and they moved to Oklahoma. And it was during the Depression, and so he came to stay with us for the weekend. And or until he got a home. And I can remember Daddy would sit at one end of the table and Hunky sat at the other end. And his name was Nathan Harsh Brown. And I think the Hunky must have come from a corruption of uncle. And maybe one of us couldn't say uncle and it got to be Hunky. I don't know. We also called him Uncle Nene. So he was either Uncle Nene or Hunky. He was a very slow eater. And he ate so slowly that one by one, everybody would leave the table. And Ruby would always pass biscuits. And he would eat a little bit of everything. And toward the end of his meal, which was after everyone had left the table, Dolly or I would frequently sit there with him. There would be a little bit of spinach or a little bit of meat and we'd say, Hunky, and he'd say, well, I've got to come out even. And he'd say, I've got to have one more biscuit to come out even, or I've got to have a little bit more of this to come out even. And it took him forever to eat his meals. So I do particularly remember that about Hunky. And it became a family joke, and we just all realized that none of us could hang out at the table long enough for him to finish his meal. And I think probably it was a nice part of the day for him because he got to be completely alone frequently. But I do recall that Daddy would say things at the table. Nate, when are you going to get a place to live? And we'd all, cry and scream and holler, we don't want Uncle Nene to leave. Daddy, don't talk about that. We want him to stay. So I do remember that about Hunky. They would call one another Mr. Brown and Mr. Chitty. They did that during this time. Daddy hired Hunky because there just were no jobs. He hired a lot of people, especially family people. Everything at the office was always very formal, and everyone was called Mr. I think also there was a certain tease about it when they got home. And my father really had a very good sense of humor, which I don't think we ever realized or really appreciated. But he could, and I think part of his saying that to my uncle about finding a place to live was part of his ability to tease, because he thought it was, to him, to get a rise out of everybody suited him just fine. They did call each other frequently Mr. Brown and Mr. Chitty. My older brother, Arthur Jr., or Artie as we called him, was a very, very kind, gentle person. He taught me to dance. Early on, I can remember we started off, I would put my feet on top of his feet and we would dance. And then the other thing I remember about my brother is that he was quite intellectual, but he would tell me things like, he would give me things like reading lists of books he thought I should read. They were always a little bit over my head, but I would read them anyway, and I probably didn't absorb nearly from them what I should have, but nevertheless. He always came up the stairs 2 or 3 at a time. He was a slight person, very kind, very gentle, had a good sense of humor. My oldest sister, Mary Ann, whom we later called Mamie, probably after Auntie Mame, because she was a lot like the character Auntie Mame. She was a disciplinarian, and she also was very confrontational with my father. So there were a lot of episodes at the dinner table, which sort of, I kind of got in the middle of it and thought it was fun, I think. Mary Ann always wanted to make sure that everything that I did was just right, or, she was she was a control freak. She and Daddy were both very stubborn, so they locked horns a lot. Mary Ann went to work at a very early age. She only went away to college for 1 year, and she came home and said she knew more than her professors. I remember Mary Ann reading law books. Mary Ann knew as much about law as any lawyer, I do believe. At least she spoke with such authority that you might believe her. In the talks I've had with Mary Ann, she felt like she went to every PTA meeting and that sort of thing, but I think by the time I really got in school, she was mostly gone, and I remember Betty as being more of a surrogate mother to me, because Betty had more of the taking care of the house, and she was much more of a home person. Marianne was, for those days, was a real career woman, and Betty was far more of the homemaker. So I remember Betty. Betty taught me to sew, and for many years I made my own clothes, and got to the point where I, frequently didn't even use a pattern. I would just design something and make it, and I did that even into my early years of my marriage, and I made clothes for the children when they were small. But Betty taught me all those things because that was her bent. And Marianne, I remember Marianne probably more when I got to be older and I would go and visit her. I remember when the war came, and Marianne and Robert, they were married in something like May, and in something like June or July, he was in a reserve unit, and he got called up, and they went to Fort Bragg, and I remember visiting them in Fort Bragg. Housing was very, very tight, and I remember the only place she could find was an office in an office building, and all the partitions were glass, and so she'd take sheets and hang them up over the glass. Today they've got cubicles that don't go all the way to the ceiling. In early days, if you were in an office building, the way you could tell what was going on in the rest, they had glass partitions, just like a window, except it was fixed. It was fixed glass. And so to give them some privacy, in one of the offices, she would hang up the sheets so that they could have a bedroom. Some of the other offices had businesses there, and there were people there in the daytime. But at night, they had a key to the building, and they were the only ones that lived there at night, that I recall. And how she talked her way into letting the owner of this commercial building live in it, but there just wasn't any place for anybody to live. And she was probably at that time maybe one of the few wives that went all these places because she had no children. A lot of women who had young children did not follow their husbands to all these little places. When I went to Fort Bragg to visit them, and I can remember going on trains during the war several times, and they were troop trains, and you could only get on if there was a seat. And I can remember being in a car, a railroad, a Pullman, not a Pullman, but a day coach or a Pullman or something, and I would maybe be the only civilian in there. But I was young enough at that point that the soldiers were no problem. If anything, they were very nice. But I must have gone up there on the train. Whether or not I was alone, I don't recall that particular thing, but I think I was. Well, that would have been probably 1942. I would have been, 12, 13? Mm-hmm. 13 maybe. From Fort Bragg, he became a general's aide, and they moved then to Abilene, Texas. I did not visit them in Abilene, but his general was killed in a small plane crash. And Marianne thought that Robert was on that plane because they were on maneuvers, and he, the general's aide, General Mann, as his aide, he would go with General Mann, on a lot of these little small flights to look at the maneuvers. So when she heard that the plane had crashed, she thought Robert was dead. It turned out that at the last minute, the general had said, "Robert, you go, and I'll take Ernie, the other aide," which he did. After General Mann died, Robert told Marianne that he wanted to be a paratrooper. So with fear and trembling, she acquiesced, and he then went on was taken to Europe on a troop ship and trained for the invasion in Reading, England, and then went from there. And he was in the 101st Division, the 501st Regiment. He was a very, very handsome man. He was not real big, and he was very youthful. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He went in as maybe a second lieutenant, probably was a first lieutenant when he went over. By the time he came home, he was a lieutenant colonel, because that's how fast he had had to go up because of all the fatalities. I can remember in the Jacksonville train station, he would be stopped by the MPs who thought he was impersonating an officer. I mean, I remember being with him, and he would have to pull out all of his ID to assure them that he was indeed a lieutenant colonel. I think he was a major then, but he ended up in being the general of the Florida National Guard. And he was general of the Guard from probably during the Cuban crisis. So we were lucky not to go to war with the Russians over Cuba. I do remember now visiting them in one other place, and that was in Pinehurst, North Carolina. He was already a paratrooper, and I can remember, and Pinehurst at that time was this elegant little community, beautiful little shops. And there again, Marion talked her way into this precious little apartment that was owned by some people named Hurd. The wife was a tobacco rentals person, and this was just a little getaway place. But the woman had decided that as part of her share of the war effort, she would rent to some of the people that were, to the officers and so forth. And I remember meeting all of Robert's contemporaries and all of their wives, and Marion remained really good friends with a lot of them, and one of them ended up they lived together during the war while their husbands were overseas in the 501, and they took an apartment 1 block from our house at 2953. So some of the war years, Marion and her friend Billy Cochran lived just a block away. And I can remember that one of the things I did with them while they lived there was we went to a lot of movies, which we all love movies, all of the girls in the family. Billy was 8 years older than I, so by the time I really had much recollection of Billy, most of my recollection of Billy is that Daddy, he was always sort of having a car wreck, or Daddy would worry about him. That would make us all worry about him. He was kind of, whereas Artie had been raised by our mother, and she always got the older children on a track of where she thought their talents lay. And Arthur Jr. was an athlete, Marion was an artist, Betty was a musician. Billy was about 8 or 9 when Mama died, and I don't really know what she would have picked for his natural bent, but he was always kind of getting into trouble. But I remember him mostly, he went away to Swanee Military Academy for the last 2 years of high school. I can remember going down, all the trains from Sewanee came in very early in the morning. And I don't think I remember ever going down to meet a train with Artie on it, because I would have been too small. But I do remember going to meet Billy. And Billy coming home from SMA, and he was very handsome. And he had on his military coat, which was a big gray military overcoat, and with a short cape. And the underneath of the cape, it was a gray overcoat, and underneath of the cape was red. And they were to take one part of it and pin it, snap it back. And our train station Jacksonville was a huge train intersection, because we would get trains from the north, trains from the south, and trains from the west. And because we were a coastal city, we were it. So it was a huge train yard, and it was a huge, gorgeous building. The train depot had a big arch. It looked like a cathedral. It was a beautiful, beautiful depot, and it was huge, and it echoed. And so a number of the gates, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they were, of course, all on the same level, but to get to 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11, you had to go underneath, and then you would go up to each of the successive tracks. The train from Swanee always came in on one of the far tracks, so we would stand up at waiting for whomever we were meeting to come up from underneath this tunnel. And I can remember when he would come up, he was just so handsome and in this uniform, and this was before the war, so you didn't see that many uniforms. And he would come up in his uniform with this red cape, and it was just so gorgeous. And usually, I'm sure Dolly was there some of the time, but I believe our driver was always hunky, because Daddy didn't drive. And I don't remember the girls going down to me. I'm pretty sure the driver was always hunky. And this was like 6:30 in the morning. And of course, it was almost always winter, so it was cold, and steam would be rising from the trains because they were locomotives, coal-burning locomotives. And then they would let out their steam, so it was always this vapor, and it's very distinct in my mind. And then the war came along. Then I think he went to the University of the South at Sewanee for 2 years, and then the war came along, and because he became a pilot, but he was stationed here in Jacksonville for a while because we had this huge naval air station. And he flew PB-2Ys, which were 4-engine cargo planes. And my job with Billy in those days, he would come rushing home from having been flying all day, and he would be getting ready to go out. And so I was to put all the gold buttons on his white uniform, but I can remember putting all the brass buttons down, putting the epaulets on, and helping him get dressed, because he was always in a hurry because he had a date. And the officers that didn't live in Jacksonville, and of course most of them lived in the BOQ, the Bachelor Officers' Quarters, which was at the air station. I do remember going out to the air station on 1 or 2 occasions, but it was very difficult to get in the gate. You had to be with an officer, with somebody in the Navy. I also remember during the war that we would bring home servicemen after church. And so we always had servicemen at our dining room table. They were usually sailors and not officers, although we had tons of officers because they dated Dolly. And Billy would always say to his friends, now if you're ever stationed in Jacksonville, be sure you call my family. So I just remember young pilots in our house constantly during the war, and a number of sailors, because I had first cousins that were in the Navy. Some of them got stationed here. They were from California. I can remember them in the house. It was quite a time. And see, Dolly and I were really the only ones home at that time. Everybody else, Marion and Betty, were married. Betty was having children, etc. and so forth. I think women spoiled Billy. I can remember married women that wanted to go out with Billy while their husbands were gone. He was very handsome, he was very charming, and he must have been an awful lot of fun for them to be with. And he also, had a lot of sex appeal, I'm sure. I don't think I recognized it at the time, except that I loved him. And he was always very sweet to me. I can remember there were PXs at all these. Can't remember now what a PX stood for, what the initial stood for, but they were commissaries on these bases, Army bases or Navy bases, where you could buy anything and sort of on the cheap. And I remember one time he bought and sent home alligator pocketbooks, one for each sister. And mine, and of course, I was much too young to have an alligator. That was the epitome to have an alligator pocketbook. And I remember he sent one home for each sister, and I remember mine was red, but it was way too big for me at my age. But I hung on to that thing for a long time, and knowing Dolly, she's probably still got hers. And I remember also he gave me a little onyx, wasn't a locket, but just a little onyx necklace with wings on it, once he got his wings. But when he got in the service, he really, he may have started drinking earlier than the service, but I know he really became quite a drinker while he was in the service. But, you know, I just remember thinking he was just wonderful, and he was so handsome and in his uniform and all these women. And I can remember there was one girl he was really in love with, but she was an Episcopal minister's daughter, and she didn't move quite as fast as a lot of people moved during the war. And it really was, it was probably, the 40s were comparable to the 20s in the fact that everybody thought maybe there'd be no tomorrow. And it was just a different feeling. He got separated, which is what from the service, in Olathe, Kansas. And I can remember he came home from Olathe with a wife named Robbie, who was from Oregon. We found out later that she had sort of done a little study of Jacksonville. She'd been married before, and she knew where we lived, even though she had met Billy. She'd never met Billy in Jacksonville, but she sort of knew about our family, and we always felt like she thought Billy was a good catch. And so he came home. He was probably very vulnerable at that time, and he was coming home to work for his father. And Daddy was not a good father to work for because he could not turn over any control to his sons. Both of the sons worked for him at one, you know, and they couldn't take it after so long a time because he was unable to turn over any responsibility to them. And Billy had wanted to stay in the Navy, and he would have been a marvelous regular Navy guy, and he would have been an admiral before it was all over, and everybody would have loved him, and he would have been good. But Daddy said, no, you have to come home, and you have to go to work. I mean, I've got this business. You've got to come home and be in the business. This is my recollection. I could be all wrong, but this is what I remember. And I think that did something to Billy. So he came home, and suddenly they had, you know, 3 children, bop, 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 bop. And I can remember babysitting for them. They lived in a house. We were 2953, and if you went down 4 blocks, they lived on Park Street. And I can remember babysitting for them with their oldest child. And I think they went and lived in the garage apartment of my cousin Clark's home. And Clark and Billy, who were first cousins, were quite good friends. And I think Clark just loved Billy. He was really, I think, very lovable. I know he must have gotten in a lot of trouble. I just don't remember. I remember Daddy worrying about him, but I never felt like he did anything wrong, particularly. That was my take on him. And then, when we moved to Vero Beach, this is really getting ahead of it, but when we moved to Vero Beach, after I was married, had 4 children, we moved to Vero, and he had gotten in an automobile accident. He'd been driving a VW, a Bug, and he had run under the back of a truck, you know, that had a big flatbed. So when we got to Vero Beach, he was in the hospital. So when he got out of the hospital, he came and lived with us while he recuperated. And of course, the accident was alcohol related. He wrecked a number of cars, and all of them were alcohol related, I'm pretty sure. Or being reckless when he was younger, just being a reckless, you know, person. Then, when he left Chitty and Company, we were living in Houston, Texas, while Jack was in a residency. And I had 3 children then, and he came to work for somebody in Houston, and he lived with us in Houston. And I remember this distinctly. He had nightmares every night, and he would wake up screaming. In fact, sometimes he never woke up, but he woke up the whole house, and he would wake up screaming. And when I asked him about it, he said he just dreamt about kamikazes. So apparently flying this huge sitting duck airplane in the Pacific, and the Japanese fighter planes trying to bomb. And he never, I don't ever remember his telling anybody in the family anything about the war years. But you know, none of them talked about the war for a lot of them never talked about what happened during the war for many years later. And I was so busy with my children and everything, I don't think I ever asked him that much. But he was drinking then. He met his second wife in Houston. She was what we called stewardesses in that day, but she was a flight attendant. And I can remember he brought Nancy to the house, and I said, I must not have been more than, I was in my 20s. And I said, Nancy, don't marry my brother. I said, he will not. He's already been divorced. He's got 3 children that he needs to support. And I said, he's an alcoholic. And she said, I can change that. And I said, Nancy, I don't think so. I said, I think this is the way he is, and I wish that you would not consider marrying him. And I looked back on it and I thought, I'm kind of interested that I had that much perception about life or alcoholism, because we didn't talk that much about alcoholism in those days. She married him and they had 4 children, and they were later divorced. He took up with another woman, or another woman took up with him. My father felt very responsible about the first 3 children. Daddy sent them a check every month. Billy, after he divorced the second wife, he left the state, and I think probably, I don't know this, but I imagine that he just wasn't able to make a living, couldn't do child support. He died in Oklahoma City with this woman who absolutely berated us for being so unkind to our brother. I don't think, she had no idea how many of us had tried innumerable times to help him and get him off alcohol. But you know, you have to want to do it yourself. So the body came home, and we had just a cemetery funeral. I mean, just the siblings. And he was 48 years old and probably died of a massive heart attack. He was almost a chain smoker, and he was an alcoholic. And I think probably there was a little bit of a history of maybe heart trouble in our family. You know, you don't really know about stuff like that. But that was Billy's saga. We felt like it was probably somewhat of a wasted life toward the end of his life. And it made us all very sad. One of the things I do want to say about all of my siblings is because I was the youngest, I was probably fairly precocious, and I thought I should be able to do everything they did. And I was very jealous that they got to do things that I didn't get to do. And I can remember that when I was 7 years old, and by that time Dolly was 12 and probably going to dancing school and probably going out at night for the final dance or something. And I wept bitter tears. I said, I am 7 years old and I have never had a date. And everybody thought that was really great. So that got quoted to me for many years. But I didn't understand why I got left at home all the time. Dolly and my brother Artie have the best dispositions that anybody in the world could ever have. Dolly put up with me. I was like glue to Dolly. How she could put up with me. Because I tagged along with her on so many things. And her friends did not want me tagging along, and Dolly just couldn't say no to me. And I really did I would have made anybody else's life miserable, but Dolly just sort of seemed to take it in her stride, and it was, you know, she was very sweet. Dolly played with dolls. Dolly loved dolls. I didn't really like dolls, but I liked Dolly's dolls. I had dolls, but I liked Dolly's dolls. And I would beg her to let me play with one specific doll, and she'd say, Gertrude, don't hurt this doll, don't break this doll. Oh, Dolly, I won't break this doll. And I can remember going out into the playhouse, which had no sides on it, had a swing in there and everything, and some furniture. and took one of her dolls. And I left it out there, and it rained that night, ruined the doll. And that's the first, and Dolly just cried. I don't think she even fussed at me, but she was just devastated that probably her nicest doll was gone. And it was all because I would do things like that. You know, she just was always so sweet, and we did go to Eastbrook together. One time, she went up a number of years. I don't know whether I went up 1 year or 2 years, but I do remember being in Eastbrook. I was a thorn in her side because she had been there, I think, before I went, so she knew all the ropes. She had her own pony. She had her own buggy. And, you know, I wanted to have my own, and I was probably 7 or 8 or 5 or 6, I don't know. I mean, I just thought I ought to be able to do everything that Dolly did or everything anybody else in the family did. So I do remember that she was always very patient with me. There was one horse that they let me ride named Molly. And Molly was a nag. There were a lot of horses up there, and some of them, she was a gaited horse, but nevertheless, they could let me ride her. Dolly rode one of the other horses that was far more unmanageable, but she could manage him. She knew the way, and we just went across pastures and down in hollows and would end up on a road. We'd have to go through a creek and maybe had to actually walk the horses had to walk in the creek to get to the Baggett's general store, which probably was no bigger than the kitchen. We always had, you know, a nickel or a dime or something, and we could buy 1 or 2 things with this nickel and dime. And my horse, as I recall, was even bigger than Dolly's, so it took Dolly to get me up on the horse. But we would buy something from the Baggett's, and I do have a picture of me and Squire Baggett. I'm 6 years old because it was 1935. Dolly took the picture, and, you know, I come up to here on him. I mean, I'm above his shoulder, and I'm only 6 years old, and I wasn't that big a child, so you know how tiny he was. And at a later date, we went back to Eastbrook at one point and visited the daughters who had a house. They were midgets too. But I remember the midgets. I remember Eastbrook. Then the next trip that Dolly and I took, we went to Maryland one summer. My father had a good friend who he had met through business. His name was Dr. Robert White, and he and his wife's name was Mady, and they had a place on the eastern shore of Maryland on the Choptank River. It was a beautiful big farmhouse, but it was just something they had in the summer. He, as I recall, was the comptroller of Philadelphia, and I do remember going into Philadelphia because that's where we caught the train when we went home. And they lived in the penthouse of an office building. And I can remember that the ceiling in my bedroom had cherubs, and I mean, it was a painted ceiling with cherubs and everything, naked cherubs. I'd never seen a naked anything before. I mean, I don't think I slept the whole time I was there for watching the ceiling. But anyway, I do remember our train trip. We got on the train, just the two of us, in Jacksonville. When we went to go into the dining car, the train was doing like this and things whipping by, I said, I think I'm going to throw up. And she said, if you throw up, I will never speak to you again. And I swallowed real hard, and I did not throw up. I don't remember that I ate much dinner, but I do remember that instance. That's the first time I remember Dolly saying anything like that to me. She said, if you embarrass me in this dining car by throwing up, I will never speak to you again. And that shook me up terribly. So I didn't throw up. Daddy had these branch offices all over the state. I had something like 20 or 30 or 37 of them before the crash, but when the crash came, he had to pull everything in. He was overextended, as somewhere in this most recent, the several recent recessions that we've had. But he did have an office in Tampa, and he had one in Miami. And of course the trains ran There was a train called the Silver Meteor that came down from New York and went to Miami. You could get on the train in Jacksonville at night, sleep on the train, and get off at Miami in the morning. See, on the weekends, if he left, he had to take, he took the younger children with him. He did not leave children alone. He was so stable, so dependable. I remember Dolly and I used to worry about Daddy dying, and we had an orphanage on Riverside Avenue. It was called the Baptist Children's Home. And they just had a big fence, but it was a big piece of property and a lot of buildings on it. And I can remember sometimes, I believe, we would walk to the Martin's house, and we would walk past the Baptist Children's Home, and they might be out playing. And I could remember thinking, if Daddy dies, Dolly and I will have to live here. We will be orphans. I must have been very small. Dolly must have put that thought in my head, because I can't, but once it got there, I worried about it quite a bit. But when I would pass the orphanage, I would think about being an orphan. So the first memories I have, Daddy took all three of us, Billy, Dolly, and me. And I can remember that Dolly and Billy and I always slept in upper bunks. Dolly and I would share an upper berth. Daddy would have the downstairs berth, and I don't know where Billy was sleeping, because when I recall his going with us, I must have been very small, but I do remember we would go. His brother Buste ran the Miami office, so we would go down and we would stay with Uncle Buste and Aunt Mary. And we were always so impressed that Uncle Buste and Aunt Mary seemed to be living a higher lifestyle than Daddy allowed us. But so we thought we were really just visiting royalty. And I'd also remember that there was a pony ride on Biscayne Boulevard. And Aunt Mary would take us to ride the ponies, and all you did was ride in a circle. But I was thrilled. But he would take us down, and we would spend the weekend, and then we would come back. And I also remember that the Pullman was always at the end of the train. And I can remember that when we got off the Pullman, there was no platform. We got off in the sand. And that is now, that's downtown Miami now. And, it's everything, of course, is megalopolis, but that was a real big memory. And we did that quite often, because whenever he'd go down there, we went with him. When my father's family started leaving Micanopy, a number of them went to Gainesville. And Daddy was the only one that went to Jacksonville. In Gainesville was Uncle Henry, Aunt Georgia, Aunt Isabel, and out on a farm in Archer was Uncle Sam. Uncle Henry had a men's store, and it was on the big square in Gainesville. There was just one big square. And Gainesville had a train track that ran through the middle of the square. And I can remember when you went to Uncle Henry's shop, store, they didn't call them shops, store, you'd have to be pretty careful whether or not a train was coming, because I don't remember that they had any kind of signals. You just had to be careful. Uncle Henry lived in a wonderful old, it would have been a semi-Victorian house, but not quite as elegant as the Victorian houses you think of. But I can remember interior was quite dark. The furniture was so uncomfortable and was probably horsehair furniture. And we would have Sunday dinner. We would go down and we'd spend the night. We'd go down on Saturday. And the road, I believe, was a brick road. Maybe not all the way down there, but it was a 2-lane. And I can remember that sometimes we'd have to stop and get gas. And the gas tanks that you got the gas from were these big cylinders. And up at the top was where the gas was, and it had like an egg beater going. When you turned it on, it would go around, which would sort of probably get all the junk. And then it would come down this cylinder and out into the tank. I remember one time we almost ran out of gas because we coasted in on a Sunday. We were going back home. We coasted into this thing. They were closed. Daddy found the man to come out and open the place and give us gas because we wouldn't have gotten home if he hadn't. But this was a return trip from Gainesville one Sunday. Now, I drove when I was about 12, and because Daddy just would not drive, and when there was no chauffeur and when all the older children were gone, if Hunky was not available for something, I would drive Daddy. Clark was driving. I remember that. Clark Chitty. He was Daddy's nephew. His parents were dead, and I remember Clark being around the house an awful lot, and Clark taught me to drive. They were big cars because there were so many of us. And then Aunt Belle was a spinster. And that was because they had told her she had to stay home and take care of my grandmother and grandfather. And she did. She never married. She stayed home in Micanopy with them until they died, although I think they may have all moved to Gainesville before they died, but Aunt Belle was told she was to, and that's what they did to some daughters in the family. They just said, you stay home and you look after, and she did. And then Aunt Georgia was married to Fletcher Hill, and I remember he was a state senator, and we would have dinner with them sometimes. We would have dinner at Aunt Belle's sometimes, but most of the time I think we had dinner at Uncle Henry's. He loved his sister's cooking, and oh God, they would make this scuppernong wine. That was the only other thing we ever had in our house, and I remember tasting it one time. It was the worst. I mean, that's, none of my sisters and I, we didn't drink. We didn't wear lipstick. We didn't drink. We didn't smoke. We just didn't want to incur any kind of anything with Daddy. It wasn't considered ladylike, and he really didn't consider it ladylike. So we didn't do any of that. But in Gainesville, I do remember that it was fun, and Uncle Henry had chickens. And I do remember going out and throwing things to the chickens. That was kind of fun. But it took so long to go anywhere in those days. Your cars didn't go very fast. The roads were very narrow. I do remember a terrible accident on the way to Gainesville one time. A car stopped in front of us, and there were no shoulders or anything like that, and probably some swales on the side of the roads. We stopped, and we got hit from behind by a car full of black people, and they probably just didn't have brakes or something. It was an old car. And the passenger went through the windshield. And I can remember, it was a woman, and Daddy hit his head on the windshield because he was in the passenger seat. I don't remember that anybody in the back seat, whoever was with us, Dolly, I'm sure, we were not hurt. But I can remember she went through the windshield. They sat her up, and of course, nobody knew that there had been an accident, so there was no way to get. And the roads were very lonely. There weren't a lot of farmhouses or anything. And I can remember watching her. Probably it was her jugular that was, and I can just remember the blood spurting out of her. It was such a vivid memory. Every time her heart beat, this blood would spurt out. And somebody had an umbrella, and they put the umbrella over. And that's all I remember about that. But I think we turned around and went home. I don't believe we went on. And I can remember Daddy sitting in his chair later that night, or the rest of the day, and Dolly and me picking glass out of his hair. There were just pieces of glass embedded in his scalp. And I can remember picking the glass out of him. So that's a memory I have of going to Gainesville. He lost his teeth when he was gone one weekend, and I think they fell in a toilet somewhere and got flushed, and he came home without his upper plate. So it took a while to get that replaced, as I recall, because I don't think they had instant teeth in those days. But a lot of people in that generation had false teeth. when they got abscesses and everything and there were no antibiotics, and they just pulled the teeth. I think I even remember when Daddy finally went to the dentist one day and said, just take them all out. I think that was when I was a child. When I was probably grammar school, my neighborhood had a lot of my friends in it. We stuck mostly to neighborhoods until we got to the age where we rode bicycles. Then kids would come in from other parts. I had a backdoor neighbor named Frances. On the next street were 3 girls, Frances, Isabel, and Marjorie. Marjorie was a year older, but I walked to school with Isabel and Frances. One more block over was Octavia. We called her Tavy. So there were 4 girls my age that were in the same classes, grade at school. And sometimes we walked together and sometimes we didn't, depending on who was late and who wasn't. I always went over and got Frances. She was an only child. Frances used the kind of leverage as an only child that I had used as the youngest child. So it was, she was very spoiled. And I would go over to get her, and they would be sitting down. They had a very formal sit-down breakfast, the grandmother, the mother and father, and Frances. Frances was very particular about what she ate. She ate a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with the crust cut off for breakfast. I would wait for her to eat. They would urge her to eat. They would try to get her to eat bacon and eggs. And finally, I would be standing in the doorway and I'd say, Frances, I'm going to leave. I'm going to be late for school. I'm going to leave. She would finally finish eating and we would walk to school together. I'm sure the Norrises were grateful for me because I'm probably the only one that could get her out of there. And I'm sure they all breathed a sigh of relief once she had left. But anyway, we would walk to school, go to West Riverside. In the afternoons, we would play tag, kick the can, jump the creek, follow the leader, and as I got a little bit older, I would play softball with the boys down in one of the parks. I was a tomboy. They hated it when I was the leader because there was a little pond down in the park and there was also the creek. And I could jump the pond and most of them couldn't. So when I was the leader, I would jump and they would all fall in or else refuse to jump it. And their mothers would get so furious because they would come home just muddy and everything, and then we'd jump the creek from bank to bank. And I sometimes, when I was the leader, I would bite off more than I can chew. Occasionally a boy or 2 would join us. I don't really remember at this point who they were. There were a couple of boys in the neighborhood I hated. They were the ones that grew up and egged Ruby on the corner. I remember pushing one of them in the creek one day when there was a moccasin down in the creek, and I was hoping it would bite him and he'd have to go get his leg cut off or something, I don't know. But anyway, we played until dark most afternoons. And when I would sometimes, we liked to play kick the can at Tavy's because of her alley. For some reason, her alley was better than our alley. And so I was a couple of blocks away from the house, so I wouldn't go home until they got called to dinner. But I knew I had to be home on time for our dinner. So I had a wonderful childhood of totally free play. There were no lessons in the afternoon. I had a wonderful time with my friends in grammar school doing all these things. And I loved to skate, had skin knees all the time. I did have a couple of, about 3 boys that we did like that would come play. And I had a boyfriend named Hal, and we were friends all the way through high school. And I can remember when I told him I was going to get married, he said, well, I thought we were always going to get married. And I said, well, you never asked me. So anyway, that's how immature he was. Sundays, we usually, Daddy and Hunky would go down to the office when I was really little. And so I guess somebody would bring him home and we would go to church. And I do remember going to Sunday school, which I didn't like. In the Baptist Sunday school in those days, they separated the girls from the boys, and I thought that was pretty tacky because I did like to, do the tomboy things with some of the boys. But When I went to church with Daddy, oh, you talk about boring, and the most uncomfortable pews you can imagine. The church, it was a gorgeous church designed by Meisner, who did all the architecture in Palm Beach and did a lot of the homes in Palm Beach, and he was very famous. And one of our neighbors, I understand, had gotten Meisner to design this church. He really didn't want to, but she was very persistent, and he finally designed it, and it is a gorgeous church. At least 3 of us were married in it. I was baptized there, and I remember very well, because when you're a Baptist, you do get dunked. And I got dunked at about age 12, and it was very impressive. I was very pleased I don't remember my spiritual attitude at the time, but I knew it was a rite of passage of some sort, so I enjoyed that. But I would go to church with Daddy, and he had his own pew. And I think a long time ago, when people built churches, and he did help build the church, they would they would just have pews that they sat in. I don't think it had a name on it or anything. And it was practically under the pulpit. And, oh, it was so boring. And so I'd lie down, and I would put my head in Daddy's lap, and I would go to sleep. I think Daddy and I would walk home from church, which wasn't that, 5 or 6, 7 blocks, I don't know. Daddy was a great walker. Daddy always walked with a walking stick. And I mean, it was an affectation. But I don't know whether you've ever seen old movies, black and whites, where sort of elegant men in New York or something would walk with a cane, and there's a certain little twist to the wrist. And in subsequent years, I have tried to walk with the cane the way Daddy did, and I can't do it. I don't get the rhythm right. But he always walked with a cane, usually I would call it a walking stick as opposed to a cane. It was probably a mahogany, because it was a dark wood, and it had a band on it that had a gold band that had his initials in it. I had to half run to keep up with him, and sometimes I held his hand, sometimes I'd skip ahead, but that was a very pleasant memory for me, and I had Daddy all to myself, which was always very nice. I remember Sunday dinner as being, I think we always had fried chicken. And at every meal, whether we had potatoes or not, we always had rice. My father was from South Carolina. South Carolina, I believe, was the rice capital of the United States. And so we had rice at every dinner meal. But we never had anything like sandwiches for lunch or anything like that. I don't know when I had my first sandwich or my first hot dog or something like that. We just didn't have things like that. But Sunday dinner would be fried chicken, rice and gravy, couple of vegetables, always biscuits. We had biscuits at every meal. The sideboard, there were always 2 or 3 desserts there. And during the war, as I say, we always had extra people. We even had extra friends. Not as often with Sunday dinner, because Sunday dinner was in the South. You always had Sunday dinners, usually with your family. Even after we moved back here to Jacksonville, as a Chitty family, we always had Sunday dinner together, either at my house, and the Days and the Harbys and Daddy and Hunky, or Dolly's house, or at Betty's house. Always, we had Sunday dinners together till we moved to Vero Beach in the 60s. Sunday dinner was the middle of the day, and for supper, the maid was not there. And so we would eat the leftovers from Sunday dinner. We called the noontime meal on Sunday dinner. After we had eaten Sunday dinner, we would get in the car and go to the cemetery. On the way to the cemetery, we'd stop and buy flowers for Mama's grave. And we would go to the cemetery. We would always stand in front of the headstone. I think Betty would do the flowers, and we'd hold hands, we'd say prayers. Daddy would say a prayer. Right now, it's a huge cemetery, but when I was small, there were fields of flowers. Depending on what time of the year, there would be literally a yellow pasture out here that would be black-eyed Susans. And then there would be a time of year when there would be phlox. I think they must have sort of neatened up the grave or something, but I would go out and run through all these flowers. I also remember that they watered with sulfur water. Now, I don't know whether you all are familiar with the smell of sulfur water, but they say that one of the big memories you have is the memory of smell. And I can remember a number of years later when I was grown, anytime I smelled sulfur water, my mind would immediately go back to the cemetery. It just was a memory that was always there. But we did do that every Sunday. Daddy got a plot for 8, but it's Mama, Daddy, Earl. Clark Chitty had a stillborn baby. That baby's there. Dolly's baby is there. Billy is there. Arthur Jr. is, I'm sure, at Sewanee. And Marion is in South Florida. When Jack and I lived here in Jacksonville, we decided that that the days that Dolly and Sam and Jack and I would buy our own plot. So we're right across the road, literally just walk right across the street, and Sam and Jack are buried there across the street. And my footstone, I went on and had my footstone done, so it's all filled in except for my death, which sometimes I feel is imminent, but who knows. Our big Chitty cemetery is in Micanopy, and we have gone down there on, sometimes, the first time I remember seeing that was probably on a trip to Gainesville, because Micanopy is not that far from Gainesville. But since that time, Charlotte had her 50th birthday and invited all the female Chitty relatives. We had a picnic in the cemetery, and all the gravestones there, and Gertrude Chitty is there. Gertrude Chitty Carter is there. It did freak me out when I saw my name on a tombstone when I was young. It did freak me out to see my name. Well, I don't feel I've said enough about Hunky and what he meant to me, because he was a wonderful raconteur, but he could tell stories to children. He never talked down to you as a child, and he always had stories to tell. And we would beg him to tell the same story over and over again. He was gentle. Dolly and Artie are like Hunky. There's just a gentleness in the Brown strain that he personified. I don't remember that he was physically affectionate, but you knew that you meant a lot to him. He was a tease, and he could tease you. He was like a magnet. He was like a Pied Piper with children. My daughter Charlotte has a little bit of that characteristic. People were just drawn to him. The women adored him. We just had some men in our family that women adored, and they adored Hunky. And of course, the fact that he was a bachelor. So the women, when they would have their parties and plan their parties, if Nate Brown couldn't come, they either canceled the party or put it on a date he could come, because he sang. He had a wonderful singing voice. The women adored him. Children adored him. Men even liked him. And he sang with the chanters, with the Shriners. He was party boy, and he smoked, and he drank, but he was a binge drinker. He did not drink when he was home. We didn't know for years that he drank. I also didn't know for years that he had a mistress. And her name was Carol Bedgood, if you can imagine that. And we would go pick Hunky up at Carol Bedgood's house. And I thought Carol was so nice. And I never understood why Hunky was coming down the steps with a little suitcase, but he would have spent the weekend with Carol again. I just thought she was a good friend. Had no idea that there was any other attachment to Carol Bedgood, but apparently there was. So that came as a big eye-opener, and I really think I was grown before I got that connection, because I didn't think about it. It was just part of the routine, you know. And it wasn't every weekend, or if he did go every weekend, somebody else took him and picked him up, and it was not. But once I do remember going and picking him up. But he was just a joy to have around, and I think he brought to our family after Mama died the kind of gentleness and fun that Mama probably brought. absolutely loved him before it was all over, because he was just a precious man. You realize that when we said that we'd call an order ice cream, it had to be eaten right away. We did not have freezers, so it would have to be eaten right away. And so Hunky would sometimes after dinner, right before bedtime or something, he'd say, "Who would like some ice cream?" And we'd all say, "Oh, we want some ice cream," because it was such a treat. Well, what he meant by ice cream, he would get a glass of milk and he would crumble up saltines in it and use an iced teaspoon, stir it all up, and that was his version of ice cream. We always thought that maybe he meant he was going to get in the car with us and take us to get an ice cream cone, but rarely did he really mean that. Well, his famous story was about why he didn't get married. We'd say, "Hunky, tell us why you never got married," and he'd say, "Well, he had a girlfriend, and he wanted to really impress her, and he was going to ask her to marry him, so he got all dressed up and he went and bought a new pair of shoes. And he said they were the prettiest shoes, and he said they were a little bit tight, but they didn't have his exact size, and they were just such good-looking shoes. So he bought them anyway. And he went and rented a buggy, a horse and buggy, and he went by to get his girlfriend. And they took a little ride, and he said his feet began to hurt. And he said when they finally got to the place where he had decided he was going to propose to her, his feet hurt so badly that they had to turn around, and he came back into town, and he never proposed to her or to anyone else. I have heard that when he and his family lived on an Indian reservation in Ponca City, Oklahoma, that he did really, when he was quite young, a young man, late teens probably, he fell in love with a beautiful Indian girl and wanted to marry her. And of course his mother said, "No way." In those days you didn't marry Indian, you just didn't intermarry. You hardly married anybody that wasn't a Baptist like you were, or Catholic like you were, or a Jewish person. You just didn't intermarry as a rule. Depending on the era we were in, early on when Hunky was always there, and he mostly was, but we would sing old-fashioned songs that he would lead us in, and they would be, things like Little Brown Jug. And as the older siblings got into the pop music of the day, that is mostly what we would sing. And I, to this day, can sing songs that I can remember the words of songs that were written in the 30s, because I sang them with my sisters every night after dinner. There were, of course, no air conditioning. And I don't ever remember the doors to the hallways being locked or even closed, but we did have transoms over every door so that they were open and you could hear sounds. And Daddy snored and Hunky snored. So Daddy would be in this part of the house and Hunky was over here. And they were never quite in sync. And Daddy would snore and then Hunky would snore. And if you woke up in the middle of the night, it was kind of hard to get back to sleep because they had very loud snores, even though they were in, quite a distance away, with all the windows and doors open. It was very noisy. I just distinctly remember that, and Dolly and I would talk about it the next morning. And then I think we talked about Daddy coming in and kissing everybody good morning. And we would sort of be grumpy because he was waking us up. Well, Daddy always had his own room. And Hunky was on the sleeping porch. And I can remember going out on the sleeping porch, and there would be people there would be young men sleeping in beds that I wasn't even sure who they were, and they would be either Artie's friends or Billy's friends, and maybe occasionally one of Betty's or Marion's boyfriends, but I don't think so, unless when the boys were all going to the University of Florida and maybe had come up for a weekend, and they would be asleep out on the sleeping porch. Very well chaperoned by Hunky. There was no way you could have hanky-panky with all these girls in one room and all these boys over there and all these grown men. What had been my brother Arthur's trophy room for all of his Eagle Scout stuff, it was a monk's cell practically. It did have 4 exposures as far as the air was concerned, but I do not remember anything in that room when Daddy slept there except the bed. And that's when Dolly and I would go get in bed with him on Sunday morning. That's where he was. But once Mama died, he just He went to the back of the house, and that's where he stayed. When I was growing up, what we called the men's dressing room, the boys' dressing room, at one time had beds in it. One thing I do want to tell you about all the way through school, when I first started in the first grade, every morning before class, we would read something from the Bible. Any Bible verse I know, any psalm I know, I learned in public school, because my class continued to do that all the way through school. Even in homeroom in high school, we would take turns. We would tell our teachers that this is what we'd always done, because you kept the same homeroom frequently. And someone would get up and go and lead us, pick out what they wanted to read that morning, and they would either read it or it would be something we could all recite from memory. And that is how I learned any Bible verses that I know. I learned in public school, which I think is sort of unusual considering today's. I do remember also we had a couple of Jewish people in the class, and their mothers came and complained that we could not read anything out of the New Testament. So all of our scripture that we learned was from the Old Testament. Walked to grammar school, West Riverside. I remember I loved to go early because you could play outside on the playground until the bell rang. There was absolutely no shrubbery that I recall. It was a dirt everywhere. We would do jump the rope. We would do capture the flag. I think sometimes we did kickball. But the ones of us who liked to do that kind of thing would get there as early as possible so that we could play until the bell rang. And we must have been filthy when we went inside because, we would fall down, scrape our knees. The principal of the school was named Miss Hughes, Hughes. I thought for years her name was Miss Shoes because Miss Shoes, you just ran the names together. And I was almost grown before I realized her last name was Hughes, because I thought one day, that is the funniest name for my principal. And she was the principal for all of my children, all of the siblings. We all had the same first grade teacher. Her name was Miss Gregory. Mary Ann thinks that there may have been a law in Jacksonville or in the school system at that time that only single women could be teachers. And all of the teachers I had were Miss so-and-so. Miss Davis was my 5th grade. Miss Wallace was my 2nd grade. Miss Gregory, that is one of my biggest memories about West Riverside. One day she called on me to read, and I could not recognize the word duck. And so I read up to the word duck and I stopped. And she said, "Say that word." And she was mean. And she said, I couldn't say it. And she said, "Gertrude, Chitty, all your brothers and sisters were smart. Why aren't you?" And I've later thought, now that I read about all these parents suing people, suing teachers, I thought that would have been a good thing to fuss about. But I'm sure I never told Daddy. And Daddy, he wouldn't have gotten mixed up in that. And if I'd told Mary and Betty, they were probably still scared of Miss Gregory themselves. I do remember in about the 4th or 5th grade, my friend Tavy was very passive. And we had a girl in our class named Virginia who was mean to Tavy. And she was really mean to Tavy, and just too many times to suit me. So one day I followed Virginia home from school to her house. And I had told my friends I was going to beat her up because she was mean to Tavy. And so several friends sort of followed me at a distance, and I did. I punched her quite a few times. Her house was in the opposite direction from my house, so she ran on home and I went home. I heard a rumor that Virginia's mother had called the school and complained. She was probably scared to call my father. She called the school and complained, and I somehow heard about that. And I thought, and I was scared of Miss Hughes. And I thought, oh my God, Miss Hughes is going to call my father. Well, I prayed for earthquakes, I prayed for hurricanes, I prayed for If I'd known about tsunamis, I'd have prayed for tsunamis, anything to happen. When one night, Daddy got called to the telephone, and somebody said it's Miss Shoes, and I just nearly died. And so apparently she told him what I'd done. And I don't remember that he fussed at me. He must have said something, but I don't remember being punished. You know, he never spanked anybody. I don't remember his saying, go to your room. He just ruled by force of his personality. And none of us wanted to displease him. And that's just what I remember, but I was so scared. It did, in retrospect, it teaches me that anticipation is so much worse. If you're anticipating something that you don't want to do or that you feel there will be something bad, it's so much worse than the actual fact. And once that was over, it was over and done with, and I don't remember any more about it. But those are the two of the things I remember about grammar school. I probably told Daddy why I had beat up Virginia, and he probably thought it was a good excuse. Well, I don't ever remember owning a pair of long pants or anything. No jeans or slacks. I don't ever remember. Oh no, and you know, you had sashes that, and I would go home and the hem would be out of my dress and the sash would be torn off. And now on Saturday, when we played, or maybe in the afternoon, maybe we went home, I think probably in the afternoon most of the time, we would get out of our school clothes and probably put on shorts. But we never went to school in shorts. There was just such a freedom about it that I don't think, you know, children nowadays, they're in very specific activities. And I think a lot of it is because you're fearful, kidnappings and all that sort of thing. And junior high is not specially memorable to me for any specific things, except that at that time I was driving, and I remember best being stopped by a policeman. I was coming back from taking Daddy home from lunch. I'd come home from lunch and I'd taken him back, and I was coming home and a policeman stopped me. And he said, how old are you? And how old I was, I told him. He said, do you have a license? And I said, if I had one, I didn't have it with me. And he said, well, you know, and I told him who I was and that I'd taken my daddy to the office. And he said, all right, go on home. You know, he knew who Daddy was. Mainly the reason he probably knew Daddy is because Daddy had a lot of black men that worked in his warehouse. And they would get very drunk over the weekend on Saturday night, and Monday morning he would go down and bail them all out. So he knew all the policemen in town, because he would always go down and get everybody out of jail on Monday morning so they could go to work. By that time they were sober. I don't remember having memorable teachers. Oh, home ec. Well, I do remember that because I had a home economics class. And there was something she wanted us to do about grocery shopping, and I mean, you know, make these lists, do these pretend things, and finally, it was just so boring. I went up to her and I said, you know, Miss So-and-so, I run the house for my daddy and my uncle, and I do all the grocery shopping, and I plan the meals, and I cook breakfast for them every Monday and Thursday morning, and I fix dinner every Thursday night and every Sunday night, and I just don't want to do this. And she said, that's all right, you don't have to do it. And she did give me an A for that grading period, which I thought was very nice of her, because I don't think she gave me some other project to do or something. But and I can't remember what the assignment was, but it was going to last for about 2 weeks. I don't want to do this. And she said, okay. High school was, you know, I enjoyed high school. I had some good teachers. As I say, my scholastic standing dropped off a little bit the last year or two because I was having so much fun. They were good times, you know. And I had still the same friends that I'd had in grammar school, but made more friends because in high school even in junior high school, more grammar schools went to and then in high school, more. I had a great speech teacher, and she put on the plays, and so we had plays. I also sang in the chorus, had a wonderful band. She led the band and did chorus, and she was the wife of somebody stationed at the air, in the Navy. She was marvelous. So I loved the singing. I loved the theatricals. There weren't that many, but there were several, and they were fun. And a lot of nice. And we went to the beach almost every weekend. I got sunburned. I had very fast skin. I peeled constantly. Went to the beach a lot, Atlantic Beach, and somebody always had a house down there. We would have house parties in high school. They would be chaperoned. It was, we had a good time. Well, in those days we had lots of dates with a lot of different people, and you didn't kiss anybody. You could maybe hug or whatever, but you didn't really do any much heavy stuff. When I talk to young people nowadays and say how many people I dated, I think they think I must have been the most promiscuous person that ever came down the pike, but it wasn't that way. You just went out with a lot of different people. So I had a lot of dates in high school. I did have Hal, and I frequently wore his L sweater, the letter for Robert E. Lee, and because he was a letter man. And then I was dating a boy at the University of the South, and so every night, and he gave me his letter sweater, which had an F on it. So I frequently wore that to school, and in the wintertime. And then I also had the fraternity pin of this boy at Sewanee. He was a Phi Delta. So I'd wear these letter sweaters with a Phi Delta pin on it. I mean, what do you call that? When you just, I don't know, but I had a pretty good time in high school. I do remember I cheated in high school one time. It's forever on my mind. I took 4 years of Latin, and I should have quit after the 3rd year, because by the 4th year I was definitely into having a good time. And I literally it was like a nightmare. I literally went to school one day and I looked at the page of Latin that I was supposed to translate, and it was like looking at a page of Greek. And the test came around, and I had to look over on somebody else's paper and copy part of their translation, because I couldn't translate first. And I just have never gotten over the fact. I never went over my head after that. And if I could have quit Latin right then, I would have. But I got a D. That's the first D I've ever gotten for that semester. When everybody had left, I can remember being a little lonely, because there was only my father and 2 old men, and they were old men. My father was 54 when I was born, and so he was the age of my friends' grandparents. When my dates would come or anything, he would say, "What does your father do?" That was the only question he ever asked my dates. And I got to the point where I would tell him ahead of time, "Daddy, his father is such and such and so and so," because he put families in a niche of what their parents did, business-wise. He only had a concept of their business because he was just not social. He told someone in the family, or some of his friends, that one of the reasons he had never remarried is that he never wanted another woman in the house that disciplined his children. He wanted to be the only disciplinarian. I thought that was a pretty interesting. I'm sure that came back to us from probably some of his friends, like Ms. Martin or Ms. Cheek or somebody like that. From John Gorey, to get home, I would usually catch a bus because it was a long way, and I took the bus to John Gorey. I would walk down Willow Branch. There was a bus that went down Park Street. Then when you got off at a certain corner, you walked another block or 2 to get to John Gorey. So I always took the bus to get to John Gorey. When I'd get out of school in the afternoon, I would take the bus home usually, and then that same bus went out to Ortega. And I would take that out, and then when I'd get to Betty's house, I would, just help babysit with the children. Betty and Earl's second house, I think they lived at the beach for a while. While they were building their house, they rented a house on Challen, and that's where Hazel was born. And I can remember going and helping look after Hazel when she was really a month or two old. Not by myself, but going and helping Betty. And I have pictures holding Hazel and taking her up and down in the baby carriage. But when I would come out here to babysit during the war, if it were wintertime, it was just dreadful because the whole house was so cold, and I think their heater never worked, their big furnace never worked properly. And she had a live-in named Minnie, and it was just always fun. I had a great time with Hazel and Mandy, and I was bossy enough that I could pretend they were mine, and they were just my first children. Because Mary Lee didn't live too far away, I can remember that Mary Lee and I would maybe walk back and forth to one another's house, or maybe I'd have the children, or she would come over. But those were good days for me, you know, other than having this secondary worry back here about how many of my brothers and brothers-in-laws and cousins were going to get killed in the war. You know, I just sort of had a good time. Betty, I did not know this until Hazel told me the other day, that Earl came home. Of course, he was on a Navy ship. He drove the landing craft in the Pacific that landed the Marines. And he never talked about his experiences to me. He may have said something to Betty, but I never remember him talking at all about it. But of course, as soon as that thing went down and the Japanese fire just mowed down these Marines, and the bodies just floating all over the water. I mean, we've all seen pictures of that. He was the officer driving this boat, and he was a very gentle man. And to think of him having to go through that experience is just, well, you know, well, of course, you all have had the Vietnam War and all that, and it's all the same sort of thing. Terrible experiences for a very young man. Marion was always one for wanting to have the four girls taken together. And she would say, well, let's have a picture. Or she would call and get a photographer or whatever, because some of them are, you know, done by photographic studios. And I don't remember her ever including the boys. And why, I don't know. Maybe they weren't around. They could have been off at school or whatever. During World War II, all the guys wanted pinups. And it was like, you probably have never heard of Betty Grable, but she was this gorgeous movie actress that could dance and sing and wore little tiny shorts and so forth. Well, they would have pictures of people like that. But then they wanted the hometown girls to look like cheesecake. It was, I don't know whether it's still called cheesecake or not, but that's sort of what you called it in those days. And so, and don't ask me why. So I can remember that we would take pictures, and I can remember all of my friends. We have a picture on the front steps of 2953, and I and Isabel and Francis and Tavy and Winifred Hardage and we would, one of us would be sitting this way and one that way, and you know, we all had legs this long because we were just teenagers. We didn't have much bosom or anything else, but we had these long legs that were sort of shapely. And that's really what they wanted to see. Well, I'm sure they wanted to see bosoms too, but the long legs was really considered great. We just took all these pinup pictures. We were in bathing suits or shorts or whatever. But what we did, and of course what they did when, like on a ship, like he was on, they would put these up all over their walls. And so they could see them all the time. And I think it was probably a contest as who could have the most on their walls at any one time. But I understand from Hazel that he brought all of them home, all these pictures home with them. And there is a scrapbook called Earl's Pinups. So every shot that he ever received, is in this scrapbook. And that's really all I know about the pinups. Summer of 1946. Oh, I went to Sewanee. It was between my junior and senior year of high school. My brother had gone to work at the University of the South at Sewanee. For the first time, they had a summer session with female students. And so I went up. He said, Gertrude, I want you to come. I went up there. I'm sure I flew up to Chattanooga, and I went up and I interviewed, and they accepted me even though I was not through with high school. I'm sure most of it was because I was Artie's sister. I went up there that summer and had a perfectly marvelous time because there were only 17 co-eds, and there were about 250 men at summer school, and most of them were veterans of World War II. They were not teenage guys. They were young men, probably in their a lot of them in their early 20s. And I remember I did fall very hard for one. I mean, I just thought he was wonderful. He was probably 26 years old. He had been a fighter pilot. And oh, he was, I thought he was so handsome. And of course, he was very charming. And that was a lot of fun.
Did you do any dating?
Oh, yeah.
Courting?
Oh, a little bit. I didn't really, I'd gotten so disenchanted with studies and everything. I really didn't care one thing about going to college. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but one of Dolly's beaux at the time, Jack Matthews, said, "You've got to go to college." And somebody from outside, your family can tell you something and you don't pay any attention. So literally at the last minute, I decided, and I don't know how I chose Sophia Newcomb. I have no idea. Didn't know anybody that had ever been there. And that's probably one of the reasons I wanted to go. I'd never been past West Florida. Probably Pensacola was as far away as I'd ever been from home in the West. Nowadays, you have to start in about the 10th grade to get into college. No problem. If you could pay the tuition, you could go to college. I would not, if Sophia Newcomb was still operating as a college, I would never be able to get in it today. But got Daddy, who was very much against higher education, got him to send in the tuition. I get on a plane. I'd had all my wisdom teeth pulled out. And I had been just, like a week before I was supposed to go. Got on the plane. The planes weren't very pressurized. And of course, they weren't jets. They were props. Got on the plane. The altitude, by the time I got there, I looked like a little chipmunk. The cheeks had swollen up. I must have just been absolutely the weirdest looking thing. There'd been a hurricane. Moyzan Airport was underwater. So the plane, which is the New Orleans airport, so the plane landed at a base in Algiers, which is on the other side of the Mississippi. Didn't know, so I mean, what was I supposed to do from Algiers? I probably had $20 in I don't even know. Got off the plane, and they were just hangars, Air Force hangars. Got off the plane, I was paged. Billy's good friend from Jacksonville, Charlie Unsworth, whose parents were divorced, but his mother lived in New Orleans, he was there to meet me in Algiers. So my brother, without my knowing anything about it, had gotten in touch with his friend in New Orleans. He had gotten in his car, come across the river, and I mean, New Orleans was flooded. I mean, it was a mess. It was 47, so it was the hurricane of 47. He and his girlfriend, who was a Chi Omega at Newcomb. So they picked me up. We find out that the dormitories are closed. So some of them, somebody had gotten some rooms at the St. Charles Hotel. And they just sort of took me in my suitcases and left me at one of the rooms that I didn't know a soul. Nobody knew me. I think I slept on the floor. And whenever the dorms opened, somehow we got out to the dorms, and that's the first of Sophia Newcomb. I'd come home during an exam period. I had exams at the beginning and exams at the end. So there was a time frame in between that I could fly home. When I got ready to fly back, the weather was so bad, the planes weren't flying, so I had to take a train. The engineer did not see that there was an open drawbridge, that the drawbridge was up on the train track at Pass Christian, which goes over a big bay. So the engine went off the track and hung into the bay. And I was in a Pullman, which was at the very end of the train. they didn't know how to remedy this. The engineer had, and the guy, the fireman who did the coal, had jumped into the bay because, you know, they didn't want to go down with the locomotive. So when it started going down, and it was very foggy, and either the lights were wrong and what they thought was green or red, or they couldn't see it. But anyway, that's what happened. So they didn't tell us what had happened, but when you see a guy with a red lantern coming through a Pullman, you know something is wrong. The train with President Truman, there was a special train that was coming through on the Spirit of New Orleans or something. They were not just a few hours behind us. And somehow they had to get word to stop that train because it would have plowed right into the back of us. So they were trying to get the signals all changed. And yet here we were in the middle of this. The entire train was over the bay because it was a very long bridge, very big bay. And I think it's called Biloxi Bay. That was exciting. They finally hooked an engine onto the rear of our train. They couldn't, you know, in those days you had to hit the trains very hard to get them to hook. And so anyway, they finally did, and they pulled us back to past Christian. They put us on some sort of cattle cars. They pulled the whole train back. I don't know whether the locomotive went in, whether they unhooked that, or whether they saved it. They pulled us back, and then they sort of put us on these cars, and we finally, 24 hours later, got us to New Orleans. I met Jack on a blind date. He was a junior in medical school. One of the boys that I had known at Sewanee was from Chattanooga. He told a friend, a girl in Chattanooga, who was a year or two ahead of me at Newcomb, that I was coming to Newcomb. I knew nothing about this. So when I got to Newcomb, she came and introduced herself. She was Betty Emick from Chattanooga. She was dating and later married Dick Field, who was a classmate and suite mate of Jack's at their medical fraternity house, which is where they lived. So they got me a blind date with Jack, and Jack a blind date with me. And the first date I had with him was for a pirate party that they had at the New Sigma Nu house, which is the medical fraternity, a big, gorgeous house on St. Charles Avenue. And that was my introduction to Jack. And so he was a very serious student, and I fell in love with him immediately. And the last thing he had on his mind, even when we got married, was that he was going to get married. Well, Cooper said, "Now, Mom, be sure and tell Dad's quote." And I said, "What quote?" Cooper said that my husband Jack, said to him, "When your mother proposed to me, I accepted, and it was the best decision I ever made in my life." Well, I didn't realize that he saw through all my subtleties. I thought I was being very subtle, and that he thought he had proposed to me, but obviously he understood that I had planned everything. But anyway, I'd never heard that quote until, and maybe Cooper made it up, but anyway. But I do remember he proposed to me in front of the public library on a Saturday. We'd been studying in the library. I was not doing much studying, but he was. He was so serious. After we both were there, after my freshman year, they tapped a few girls to be in a group called Assets. And if you were tapped for that, you had to stay after school was out. And that was great because Jack was the house manager for the fraternity house. And they were doing a new kitchen, and he had to stay and do some things in the kitchen. So we were both there. He was not in school studying every minute, and so he didn't have to go to class every day, and I didn't have to go to class every day. I think that's when we became, good friends. We'd had a few dates before that, all year. But that was the first time I think he'd kissed me. I didn't think he was ever going to get around to kissing me, and so I was very pleased that it finally came to fruition. But we were parked in a car on St. Charles Avenue in front of the house that my friend Nancy was living in with her friends, because she had graduated and they were all working in New Orleans. So they were renting this big house, and that's where I was staying. in the spring of 47. And I did not know Jack was as serious about me as I was about him, and I was very surprised when Jack asked me, no, it was the spring of 48. Yeah, spring of 48. And I was very surprised when Jack asked me to go out to have dinner with him and his family. His parents were coming to town. And I was just quite stunned. So of course I said yes. And when we got in his little car, he had a little, it must have been a Ford, and it was 2 doors, but there were little jump seats in the back. When you weren't sitting on them, you could undo them and they just go up flat against them. So anyway, I was in the front seat with Jack. We go and pick up his parents at the St. Charles, and they're getting in the car. She gets in first, and he makes them sit in the back seat, these little jump seats. Mrs. Terry, Viola, Pitty Pat, several different names for her, got in the back seat, sat down, and as he was getting in, Jack said, I would like for you to meet my date, Gertrude Chitty. And Willis absolutely, my father, future father, absolutely paused in mid getting into the car. I was leaning up like this so that so that he could get in the back seat. And he stopped right there and he turned and looked at Jack and he said, he looked at me and he said, how do you spell that name? You put a little S in there and it gets a different name. And afterwards he fussed at Jack for not telling him my last name before he met me, because he had never heard the last name of Chitty before. Now that night we just ate out, the 4 of us. The next night they had the Goodsells with them, whose grandson later married my daughter, Gretchen. So we've got all these connections. Anyway, Jack suggests that we go for dinner, and then he suggests that we go to the French Quarter to one of the stripteases. There was a very famous stripteaser named Stormy, and Stormy danced on a bar with a G-string. And we went to this bar, and I was just appalled. I thought, boy, I mean, I can imagine my father, even thinking I'd gone to a place like this. Well, after it was all over, Stormy came out and did her bumps and grinds, and of course that's where we went for dates. We always went to the French Quarter. So here was Stormy doing bumps and grinds, and after it was over, Mr. Goodsell said to me, have you ever been here before? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, you should be ashamed of yourself. So that was my introduction to the Midwest parents of the world. He and his family invited me up to Michigan to visit at the cottage. My father said, absolutely not. I don't know these people. You are not going anywhere. He got in touch with my sister Marianne, who lived in South Florida. She was having her 2nd child. He said, Marianne, you've got to, So Marianne said I had to come down there and help her with the children, and Daddy had said I couldn't go. So Jack, on his way back to medical school in the fall, detoured from Illinois to Jacksonville, Florida, to meet, to come see me. I remember I was at the beach. I was waiting for Dolly and Sam to pick me up to bring me home. They were always late. And I wanted to get home before Jack got to my house, because I thought it would be terrible for Jack to have to meet my father without somebody running interference, and it was a Sunday afternoon. And so when I got there, when we were coming down Riverside Avenue, I looked and I saw Jack's car. So I knew he was already there. And one of the first questions Daddy asked Jack, apparently, and he walked in, told Daddy who he was, I guess. And Daddy, at that point, was on a cornflakes kick. And for Sunday night dinner, he wanted to eat cornflakes. Well, he had invited Jack to have cornflakes for dinner with him. And I thought, oh, what is Jack going to think? Because, I got there and they'd had cornflakes and whatever. And one of the first questions Daddy asked him was, now, how is the corn crop? in Illinois this year because Daddy always cared about crops because he sold canned goods and, you know, was it a good corn crop? Was it a big, which would mean how much he was going to have to pay for it. Well, Jack didn't know a thing about corn in Illinois, but I don't know what he told him, but anyway, I know that was one of Daddy's first questions. But then in the fall, we began to get a little serious. And when he proposed to me, although he says I proposed to him, and I'm sure I, you know, made a few moves that got us where we were. When we decided we were going to get married, I said, well, we'll get married after you graduate next June. Well, he said, well, I've got to go into my internship. You know, there won't be any time. And I said, so we moved it back to Easter. Anyway, we finally had to come back to Christmas, which suited me fine. But that was the only time where he really had that much time off because medical school did not allow you much time off, nothing like the other colleges in those days. So I remember we flew home for a weekend, and Jack had stomach cramps all the way on the airplane because he was so nervous because I'd, you know, told him what Daddy was. I mean, he had a good idea by that time what Daddy was like. But he did ask Daddy, and I was afraid Daddy would say no. And I got to thinking about it many years later, and I thought, he must have been thrilled to get rid of his last daughter. My God, how wonderful that would be. But Daddy said, how are you going to support her? Well, nobody had thought about that because in those days you did not get paid for a residency or an internship. You did it for free. And somewhere along the line, Mr. Terry had said he would take care of all the bills. He must have told Jack that. So Jack told Daddy that, and that seemed to make it okay. And at that time, we were all getting dividends from Chitty and Company, and you know, dividend went a long way, but anyway, not enough to support us. Jack and I, our most definite worry was how our fathers would get along because they were both very opinionated, very politically oriented. I mean, in those days, politics were really a big thing, as if they are today. And Willis was an Illinois Republican. And of course, Chicago was the big Democratic. I mean, the corruption of the politics in Chicago, really probably always, I don't know about today, but for many, many years, they were famous for their corruption. And they were Democrat. It was a Democratic regime. And my father was a Southern Democrat. And Jack and I just were terrified of how our fathers would get along. Well, their political views were identical because Southern Democrats were very conservative. Northern Republicans were very conservative. And not that we really had that much so-called liberalism in those days, but those were the first beginnings of the Depression had started all the social programs. And so Daddy and Mr. Terry considered them giveaway programs. And of course, in retrospect, you realize that Roosevelt saved so many people by putting these social programs in, but it meant that the taxes that these men who had worked very hard to bring themselves up by their bootstraps and so forth were paying a lot of money in taxes that they had never had to pay before. They were soulmates. They would write each other afterwards and telegram for each other when somebody would win an election that, you know, they were both happy about or something. I have some telegrams about, you know. We did get married in the 28th of December. I don't know how Betty did it. I don't know how Dolly was pregnant, was 8 months pregnant. Mary Ann lived in South Florida, and they did everything to prepare. I mean, they ordered the invitation. I think Jack and I did go somewhere the weekend we were here for his asking Daddy for my hand, and we picked out china and silver and, you know, all that stuff. They did everything else. I thought, you know, big deal. They don't have anything else to do. I mean, until I got grown, I didn't realize what I had asked of my sisters, all of whom had families, small children, all were pregnant. And I don't even remember when I got fitted for my wedding dress, probably over Christmas. You know, probably before Christmas. We didn't really have time for a honeymoon. We, were on our way from Jacksonville to New Orleans, and the Terrys were 24 hours behind us, bringing china and stuff that we were going to, use in our house. Our first rental house was in the basement of this gorgeous antebellum home on St. Charles Avenue, but we were in the basement, and we were lucky to get the basement because housing was still so tight. Nothing had been built during World War II. So we were just, these people needed the extra. They were sort of the landed gentry poor, and there were medical students that lived on the third floor, and we had the basement apartment. I see, we were married in December. By April, I was pregnant. Much to Mr. Terry's horror, here he's going to have to support another mouth to feed. And so I had terrible morning sickness. I barely was able to go to Jack's graduation without throwing up on everybody. And then we were going to Chicago for his internship, which was going to be a 2-year internship at Presbyterian St. Luke's. I was so sick, I couldn't go to Chicago with him. I stayed in Galesburg. And finally, they had to put me in the hospital and give me fluids because I was so dehydrated. Got well from that. Go up to Chicago. No place to live in Chicago because nothing there again. Everybody was home from the war. Everybody needed housing. No housing available. There was a wartime thing called the OPA, Office of Price Administration. They had put ceilings on all. They'd not let the landlords raise their rents. So of course I was trying to get us in one of these places that had a ceiling rent. Well, that was ridiculous. But I remember what Marion had done at Fort Bragg. She would go talk to the milkman and see if he had to quit delivering milk because there was a vacancy. Well, I couldn't find anything. So we met a dentist and his wife and their children, the children being our age. And one of the girls was married, was going to have a baby, and she was going to move. They were going to move back in with her mother and father. So they sublet us their apartment, which was in Cicero. And Cicero was the big gangster, a little city within a city in Chicago. All the gangsters came from Cicero. Our apartment had a common wall with the fire department. And when the gong went off, it was at the head of our bed. Now, Jack was almost never home. In that building was a golf pro and his wife. They had a much better apartment at the other end of the building. So we met, and they were lovely. So I met a nice couple in that building. All this time I would be looking for housing. I finally found us an apartment that was in a third-floor walk-up in the Polish and Jewish section of Chicago, where on the street that you only heard Hebrew or Polish, and our landlord was Polish. And the Terrys, of course, God bless them, had told us what our budget was, and this was what I could get for what they could afford to send to us. And I'd get checks from Daddy every now and then, but not enough to live on. So the first time they came to see us in Chicago, I was pretty pregnant with Johnny, and they were so horrified with the neighborhood that they just couldn't believe that we were living there. And as Jack still wasn't there very often, and I felt pretty safe on the third floor because I didn't feel like anybody could get in. And I would keep the car because he wouldn't be able to get off. But sometimes I would get in the car and he would call me maybe 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, and he'd say, I've got a coffee break, I've got 30 minutes. Or he'd call me a little bit ahead of time, and so I'd go down and we'd see each other for 30 minutes. One night I do remember very distinctly, we had a Louisiana tag on the car, naturally. And I was driving down to the hospital, and I had to cross a street called Madison. Madison was like the Skid Row of New York. And there were about 5 or 6 black guys. I had to stop for a red light, and they took a look at me, and they got on each side of the car and they rocked the car. Now this was in 49, and I don't remember that. I don't remember. It's coming from the South. I just don't ever remember feeling threatened by black people, and I didn't know what to do. But they rocked that car, and finally I just ran the red light. Looked both ways. It was nighttime. There wasn't anything coming, so I just gunned it and went on. But that kind of left me a little shook up. I was about probably 7 or 8 months pregnant. Johnny was born there. Oh, in the meantime, I come home from the hospital with Johnny. My sister Betty came up to help me with the baby. And one day Jack came home from the hospital in the middle of the afternoon. I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, let's take a drive." Well, this deep in snow, I was nursing the baby and dripping all the time. And what? So anyway, we take this drive. We go out to Oak Park, which was a suburb, and Mr. Terry had rented us, had gotten very chummy with the man who had built a 4-unit apartment in Oak Park. They talked about World War I experiences together, and he got us an apartment in that place. And I had spent so much time trying to get this 3rd floor walk up, looking like home. And I just couldn't believe they were going to do this to me. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you one thing. You all are going to have to do all the moving. I'm not doing any of it. I'm not going to put shelf paper. I can't. I was like 7 days postpartum. I'm not putting in shelf paper and putting up curtains and blah, blah, blah." So they got me a suite at the Oak Park Arms Hotel. And Johnny and I stayed at the Oak Park Arms, and I had room service, and I thought that was very nice of them. Fortunately, Willis lived to be 101, and I was able to apologize to him for being such a spoiled brat and making him do all that. I said, "I just want you to know I'm very sorry I acted that way." And he said, "I hoped I would live long enough for you to forgive me." So anyway, that was all. So once we moved into that apartment, then Charlotte was born. So I had 2 Chicago babies born in the same hospital where Jack was, Presbyterian. Then the Korean War came, because although he had been in World War II, because he was now a doctor, and had gone to school on the GI Bill, they called him back because he was now a doctor. He was stationed at Biloxi, Mississippi. We were stationed there. We first lived in what were, in those days, called tourist cabins. And it was right on the Gulf, and it was just a little ring of cottages. And the little cottage we had was a tiny living room, tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. So the 2 babies, were in 2 cribs in one of the bedrooms, and the other was for Jack and me. Now, he got home, once he was in the Air Force, he got off at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we lived there, and then you had to apply to get onto the base. So from there we moved into some converted barracks, which were on the base. This was Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. We moved into this converted barracks, lived there for a while, moved into what was called Wherry Housing, named for Senator Waring, because Wherry. They had started a thing that said the bases have to have better housing for these people, So these were nice little brick houses. They weren't very big, but they were new, and my God, I hadn't had a kitchen like that since the house in the new apartment in Oak Park that had a thermostat, by the way. Anything else we'd lived in, we were lucky to be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Had Gretchen there. And Gretchen was a very difficult birth. She presented as a brow. It was a very difficult birth, and it left her with a little bit of a problem with her right side, which has never seemed to handicap her. She was a great tennis player, and she rides horseback and ropes cattle and castrates cattle and artificially inseminates cattle and anything else that needs to be done on the ranch today. So Anyway, so we had Gretchen there, and those were pretty good years because we got to make some friends with other doctors who had also been called back into the service, and Jack had very decent hours. We got paid. I know Mr. Terry was so grateful. We got a salary, and we saved a lot of it because we just didn't really have that many expenses, and we could buy stuff at the PX, and it was cheap. And he was offered the opportunity to go to Germany, and I said, you move us to Germany, and and if you volunteer for active duty in Korea, just forget it. And if you had children, you did not have to go to Korea. And he was serving a purpose. This was a training base for all these planes and people that were going to Korea. Then we moved to Houston, and the Terrys bought us a house in a suburb of Houston. It was the first suburb west of Houston, called Bel Air, because Houston then was just sort of beginning to be a booming oil town. So we were there for 3 years. I didn't see Jack very much. He worked for Dr. DeBakey and Dr. Cooley, and he helped do a lot of the first surgery that was done for arterial surgery, putting in grafts and so forth for aneurysms. So that was our stay in Houston. Then we moved to Jacksonville, and Jack went into practice with Sam Day, his brother, Dolly's husband. And we moved next door to Dolly. My house, Dolly's house, Betty's house, and they were 3, 7, 10 first cousins within a block. And they all went to Ortega Grammar School. When we moved back to Jacksonville, Hunky and Daddy were living in Clark Chitty's garage apartment, which had the most treacherous steps you can imagine. We remodeled our dock house, and it had 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and bath. And that's where Hunky and Daddy spent their last years. I can remember my brother-in-law, Earl, who had such a wonderful sense of humor and eventually worked for Daddy. And he would come down to see them or pick them up, and he'd walk in and say, what time is this boat leaving? Because it was a dock house right out over the water. I would eat lunch with them down there. And Dolly or I would frequently go down and eat lunch with them. They had a maid that would come in and cook for them, or they'd eat dinner with us, or maybe sometimes they'd eat dinner down there. It just depended. With all of us here in a row, it was very easy for us to look after them. Every Sunday, we would have Sunday dinners together, 3 families, and as I say, either our house, one of the 3 houses. The house we moved into was really, we bought it mainly because of its location. And it was not, while it was a very strange house, it had probably started off being a fishing shack on the river and had stuff built around it. But it was fairly adequate for 3 children. So then, after we'd lived here about 6 or 7 years, we lived here for 10 years. After we'd lived here for about 6 or 7 years, Jack had gotten established well enough, and we felt like we could remodel the house and add on to it, which we did. And after that was done, we'd always wanted to have more than 3 children, but I'd been really traumatized with the birth with Gretchen, and I'd had a postpartum depression after that, which was god-awful. And to have 3 small children and not to even want to get out of bed and comb your hair, we started talking about having more children. And I said, listen, Jack, I would love to have more children, but promise me that if we have more children, we will not move again. I don't think I can move again. He said, we won't move again. We added on to the house, it was great. We won't move again. We have Cooper. Cooper is 10 pounds, 1 ounce. I mean, I didn't think he was ever going to come. I was as big as the house itself. Got to the hospital, had him in 20 minutes. This big, beautiful, wonderful baby. And everybody, Charlotte became he's talking about a surrogate mother. Charlotte took care of Cooper. She just loved taking care of the baby. I don't remember that Gretchen and Johnny were that involved but she was just kind of a little mother. She would have been about 12 years old. When Cooper was about It was 1969. The four sisters and Helen decided, Helen said, "You all, I want to take you to all the places I've been in Europe." Well, I don't think at that point any of us had ever been to Europe. I know I hadn't. And I don't think the others had either. So Helen plans this whole trip to take us to her favorite places in Europe. And we were going to end up in Rome. And I said, as long as I am in Europe, I want to go through the British Isles. And I want Jack to bring over the children and meet me in London, meet us in. So Marion opted to do that, and Helen opted to do that, and Helen opted to bring her two daughters over at the same time. Well, of course, we went over on the SS France, which was just a wonderful. We went to Paris. I can remember that we had a flat tire on when we went to in some big limousine, and had to all get out and stand by the side of the road. We were on our way to Versailles. Mostly, I remember these wonderful meals that we had. Of course, there was a lot of sightseeing, and we went to Pompeii, and we went to Capri. We stayed in marvelous hotels. One night, coming back from Capri, we waited. There were no boats left. The regular boats, they were not running. We hired a little boat to take us across the Bay of Naples. These huge freighters on all sides of it. And I don't even think our boat had running lights. Helen is a brave person, and she just pulled all of us along with her. And this guy I'm not even sure it was his boat. He probably stole it off the marina or something. And we just somehow wove our way through this dark Bay of Naples. It must have taken us 30 minutes to get from Capri to Naples. And so then and our hotel was right on the bay. So, and there were quite a few of them, so we had to sort of land at the right place. And Helen recognized the hotel. But I remember that as being quite an experience coming. And the rest of the time, Helen drove. And she did get us lost big time in Naples. And we ended up in streets where the streets were just full of people. And we would try to tell them where we were going, and they were just happy and were sorry we weren't out of the car so they could pinch us. And I do remember coming out of Switzerland and coming into Italy. I hate heights, and I was just frantic on these little tiny mountain roads that just did like this. We crossed the Swiss-Italian border, I think 3 times to try and get to where we were going in Switzerland. And Helen is a fearless driver also. And Marianne went to sleep because she could go to sleep at any time, and she hated this kind of drive so much she just went to sleep. She was wonderful with mind over matter. And at one point she opened her eyes and she said, "This is no road, this is a pretzel." And it was indeed. But we finally got to our destination. Helen was a fearless driver, a fast driver, but fearless. We went to Florence and Rome and Venice. Oh, we went to Harry's Bar in Venice. Oh, and in Paris, we went to the Follies, Bergère. There was no place for us to sit. She knew how to bribe head waiters and that sort of thing. We ended up with a table right in front. We go to Venice, she wanted us to go eat at Harry's Bar. No place in Harry's Bar. She bribed somebody. They had a table this big. They put us right down and put it down someplace with 5 chairs. And I remember we had steak tartare. And I did. I don't know what they had. And later on, when I saw the boats that were bringing the meat into Venice with all the flies and all these filthy canals, if mad cow disease had been on the market in those days, I certainly would have gotten it because I loved that steak tartare. So after we finished our European trip, which they may have told you something about, we go to London. And Dolly and Betty were in Rome, and they remember seeing the first landing on the moon. It was on television. And so when we got to London, in fact, on the plane ride, I think, to London, they told us that they'd landed on the moon. This was the first moon landing. Anyway, we get to London. Jack has flown over with 5 teenagers. Let's see, Johnny would have been about 18, Charlotte would have been about 16, Gretchen about 14, or Johnny would have been probably 17, 16, and 15, and Helen's girls were the age of my girls. So he flew over with 5 teenage children. And Jack had been very much like my father. He had not been a very hands-on father. He didn't have the time because he'd been in training. So anyway, when we got ready to go over there, Cooper wanted to go. And Cooper was 6 years old, and I said, Cooper, I don't think you will enjoy what we're going to do. I said, now, what do you like to eat? And he named hot dogs and hamburgers. And I said, well, darling, they do not serve hot dogs and hamburgers in England. And God knows they didn't in 1969. You know, in restaurants, nothing stayed open. Everything was very set. You ate when a restaurant was open. You couldn't just go in someplace at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and have a sandwich. There was nothing like that. Maybe tea at 4 o'clock if you went to the lobby of a hotel. So I've managed to talk Cooper out of wanting to go because of his dietary habits. So anyway, he gets left at home. We met everybody in London, stayed in London, went to some plays, and I had planned the England and Scotland trip. So we rented 2 cars and we went to all these really what I planned in England, and then went on up into Scotland. Stayed at the Caledonian in Scotland and got to see the big castle out of our windows. It was a wonderful trip. Johnny and Jack don't remember it as a wonderful trip because they had to pack the cars every day. Every time we left with suitcases, and I think we had 17 pieces of luggage. Well, there were all these women and girls, and I do remember going in Brown's Hotel in London, and the girls had ordered room service. And you literally could hardly pick your ways between the trays on the floor because they were, had ordered so much room service over the period of a day or 2, and I had not put them out in the hall. And I think the maids gave up on their room. But we had a really good time. So that was Marion, Helen, me, the 5 teenagers, and Jack. And Jack and Johnny's recollection mostly is packing and unpacking the car because the luggage mostly had to go, a lot of it had to go on top of the car. I think having good standards, good morals, good ethics, being loyal, and always having a sense of family from the standpoint, families don't always like everybody. There are always a lot of tensions between people because unlike friends whom you choose, you don't really choose your family. But I think you should always have a responsibility. You should remember that you have a responsibility of some sort to the members of your family. And you should always be loyal to your friends. And I guess that's about it. Can you think of any other questions?